So guess what I realized today?
What'd you realize?
As we're mic checking, this might be the way to start it, or
Yeah.
it might just be a good mic check. I realized it's been 4 years since we did not implement net neutrality and the world ended. It's been 4 years.
I can't believe it. I heard Ajit Pai is retiring on January 20th.
I saw his interview with Reason.
Oh, yeah?
And it was interesting. I couldn't help but just like that. Do you remember when the worst thing that could happen on the planet was that we might not implement net neutrality? I think that was really the first signal of like the center-left technological shibboleth.
It was Bernie Sanders said it was the end of technology, or the end of the internet as we know it, right?
$5 a tweet. That's apparently hasn't happened.
Someone big said that.
Yeah,
I can't remember who, but I remember that being a thing.
I remember Wikipedia had a thing about the internet being slower because of net neutrality. It's like, Wikipedia.
Well, what do you expect of Wikipedia?
I don't know. I don't know what I expect. It's just like, come on, man. Like, just stop.
Well, and the whole thing started because wasn't it because Netflix didn't want to have to pay more for all of the bandwidth that they were hogging? Right, because like 50% of the internet was being hogged off by Netflix, which makes sense because market demand. Mm-hmm. Netflix controls, everybody has a Netflix account, right? Mm-hmm. So they were paying premium for high internet speeds, and they didn't want to have to pay for that, and it all started because of that.
It was kind of that, but it was also like that. Internet service providers were sometimes throttling Netflix and like in negotiation disputes and all that kind of stuff. And it's an interesting problem because it's like we run the experiment now, and we know that net neutrality was a giant waste of time and energy politically, and that a free market system that we pretty much have implemented where we allow businesses to work that out and allow consumers to decide and to maximize supply and innovation within the market was actually the solution. But it's funny to me, like the panic. That's especially what's interesting to me because that's really where you saw all these corporations get together and all decide we got to panic about this thing right now, and that was probably the first time, and now we see it again, over and over again.
You scratching your belly is being picked up by the mic.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Mic check 1 2. Yeah, here I might have to put it a little, but no, I completely agree, and because we had 2 net neutrality scares, because there was the original one under Obama, then there was another scare that happened under Trump, right? And under Trump it was the reverse because it was repealing it, right? Yep. Because apparently putting it in changed so much, right? That was a whole scare, and it was a 4. I just had somebody. I think they followed me on Twitter today. It was the account was called "Survivor of Net Neutrality Apocalypse." So it's strange that you thought about that.
And now we got the Section 230 debate, which is like replace that as the thing that everyone's freaking out about. But obviously, the corporate media giants are like in the firing squad for that one, less so than the were for net neutrality. Well, and you just got repersoned. Welcome back to
barely, sort of
Facebook personhood.
Yeah, I did get repersoned on Facebook. I still think some of my other stuff is being throttled right now, though.
Really?
Yeah, just because I'm having important emails all being sent to spam, and all I'm getting, like literally all I can get out of my email is like advertising.
Really?
But like anything that's from like people in my contacts list, apparently it's going to spam. Like 80% of it.
That's weird.
Yeah.
Who uses email though? Come on.
Well, I mean, like, important stuff that you gotta do.
Time to get a Proton mail, my friend.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm thinking. I just need to go full on encryption with everything, I think.
So my name is David Herbst.
And I am Kyle Mack.
And this is the No Strings podcast, and where we talk about stuff.
Whatever we feel like.
Man, we went so deep last time. Like, we went, like, straight.
We were talking about absurdism and meaning. It started with the conversation about science.
I mean, like,
and whatever that is.
I was really happy about that podcast.
I was too.
Really.
I think it was one of our better ones. We clicked a lot better.
I'm wondering, if we don't want to do that every time, though, we might want to do something a little bit more frivolous, a little bit lighter, like the world didn't end. The world's probably not going to end anytime soon. That there are major challenges to the world, but the world's getting better for the most part.
Yeah, like the evolution of humanity is getting better, but there's always hiccups. Right?
Yeah, right. There's always challenges. There's things that are happening. But think about it this way. We get nitrogen from the air, and then we put it in the ground, and that's how we feed everyone. Think about that for a minute.
I mean, that's harming the planet, Dave.
I know, but you don't get it. We literally take things out of the air and we put it in the ground to grow plants. Think about that, and we make physically material things to sprinkle on the ground to put nitrogen in the ground. That's incredible. And like we were all going to survive because the only source of nitrogen on the planet was bat guano up to like World War I. So just imagine, you just got these people who all they did was literally mine bat poop. That was an entire industry around bat poop. And we were running out of bat poop to mine because there was only like a couple like major
we're having a bat
deposits.
Poop shortage. We're at peak bat poop.
Right? And so like all of the people who are in the know, who are all, thinking about this issue was like, wow, we have a sustainability problem. Mm-hmm. So what we got to do is just go back to the era where we didn't have nitrogen. And then they did the math and found out, like, well, wait, we can't do that because we couldn't feed the current population at that time. So, of course, they said that it was going to be a catastrophe and everything was inevitably going to be destroyed. And there wasn't. And that was because a guy figured out how to, a bunch of people collaborating together who didn't even know each other worked together in order to discover this process of taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere and turning it into a physical, a hard material that could then be broken up and then sprinkled on the ground to make nitrogen.
And that's kind of the thing. Like it's a similar thing to the net neutrality stuff, right? Where you always have these scares. Mm-hmm. Like it's the Malthusian trap, as someone said. Can't remember who said that. Can't remember who said that.
It's a Matt Ridley. Yeah,
is that Matt Ridley that says that? Yeah. Yeah, but because there's always, you're going to have too much population. You're not going to be able to feed anyone. Well, we figured out the whole nitrogen thing, and we're figuring out other ways of producing large amounts of food with far less effort or, resources needed. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is just typical politics. Usually, is how all of these things work. There's this large pessimism. There's this large problem that needs to be fixed, and there might be like a small issue here or there, but they just exasperate it into this like life-changing thing. If it doesn't get fixed now, then everything about a certain industry or humanity itself will be ended. And then usually innovators figure something out. Usually the problem wasn't as bad as everyone thought it was, and then we move on. Mm-hmm. Right?
And we kind of forget about it. Like the real tragedy is that we're kind of
that's what I want to talk about.
Trapped in the current panic of whatever the current panic. Now, that doesn't mean it's not real panics and real dangers. Like, don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. Real things to be concerned about. And I don't want to diminish that with the dialogue, but man, it is. Yeah, there was one point where people seriously believed that Dungeons and Dragons was a vast conspiracy of Satanists to corrupt the minds of the youth. And serious people thought that and spent serious time legislation.
Or playing Kiss songs backwards were the words of the devil, right?
Exactly. And that's not like we do the same thing right now. We're doing the same thing right now. We just have different theories, different explanations. Interdimensional psychic vampires, perhaps.
Which is... To defend Alex Jones, he's on the Rogan podcast. He was very clear that he doesn't believe that; it's other people believe that.
Right. I'm sure that's
his thing is that the elites believe that.
That's always a great backup. It's not me that believes it. I'm just repeating what they think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with Bohemian Grove, who knows, right?
Who knows? That's true. But that thing is like, how do you break out? How do you turn that is to a not? How do you get a prescription out of that thing? Like, what should people do to avoid getting caught in a panic?
Well, it's also difficult because there are things worth panicking about sometimes, right? It's just oftentimes they're blown out of proportion. Mm-hmm. And maybe there's a bit of an Overton window thing that happens there.
What's the Overton window?
The Overton window is what is allowable opinion, and it shifts based off of people on generally the radical elements of those edges push it one way or the other on a spectrum. And I think there's probably an argument that you could say that spectrum has gone very leftward over, recent decades.
So example of
a steady trend towards it.
So an example of an opinion that's within the Overton window would be like, COVID-19 is a very dangerous disease that warrants public policy response. Something outside the Overton window would be something like COVID-19 is a biologically designed weapon from China to destroy the West. It's not that it's it's not that it's necessarily true or false, but it sounded like people kind of treat things.
What's allowed to be said?
Yeah, what's allowed to be talked about at a given time. What's within the acceptable range?
Yeah, for you to be like a credible person, you have to operate within a certain window.
Right. And it's a lot of it has to do with conclusions that people have made about what's true and false. Right. So they've just decided that there isn't any evidence that it's a bioweapon, so therefore we're not going to talk about that. And at some point that's a good thing. And at some point we don't want to talk about everything. Sometimes we want to kind of like say, that's not an important topic right now because we don't have any evidence for that. So therefore, we're going to move on to different topics.
I don't even necessarily know if it's just about whether or not there's evidence on something. It's often just like any potential evidence of a thing will get pushed out and you're ostracized for it. If that's also an element.
Yes, that's right. That's true.
And I'm not saying specifically on the bioweapon, but just like on ideas in general.
I'm trying to point out the only good thing about it. The best thing about it, the reality is that people do have a limited bandwidth and a limited capacity to keep so many things in mind at any given time. And that's why like various different research groups exist in order to raise up those issues and make them into an important issue, in order to make them more, in order to raise up their identity level so that we can have a dialogue about them.
You never let a crisis go to waste, right? So that's where that's the opportune time for political people to jump on and shift public opinion on something. Like 9/11 is an example of that with the Patriot Act. You use that fervor that everybody has and that unity that everybody has, and you institute the Patriot Act. You start pushing in FISA courts and things like that.
So what is the Patriot Act of COVID-19?
I think that we have a lot of people that now have a lot of data on what people are and are not willing to put up with. The lockdowns are one of those major ones, right? Especially in some states where governors are taking like very large steps in their restrictions. And we saw the initial scare, right, where there was like a 2-week unity period when the initial lockdowns all happened. Remember, he's like, just 14 days is all we need to flatten the curve. And we saw that, and now we're here. It's December, right? And we still have massive lockdowns. Like, we actually had governors in some states like banning Thanksgiving, right? Or putting large restrictions on Thanksgiving. We're seeing the same thing on Christmas. You have Governor Cuomo saying like how you really celebrate Thanksgiving is not going with your families because you don't want to hurt them, and like that's the propaganda tool for it, right?
So to kind of dissect that a little bit, there's definitely the panic of that. There's like the rational like, I need to protect the vulnerable people in my life and make sure that my great aunt who has pre-existing conditions doesn't go to Thanksgiving because, that's a danger for her, and kind of overcoming that with reality, right? There could be facts in there worth talking about and having a dialogue about, but there's certain ideas that are outside the Overton window that we're kind of pushed out, or that Overton window shifts left to right. If you kind of think of the left-right spectrum, there are many ideas that are much more acceptable to the left wing than there are right ideas that are acceptable in right wing. In the New York Times, right? And these different media kind of organizations kind of shape the field of play, if you will, for ideas at a given time. And that's what the Overton window is trying to describe.
Yeah.
So we were talking about that in relationship to the panic at a given time.
Well, and the panics are often used as means of pushing that and then people's mindset on that spectrum for a given issue will shift along with it because of the panic.
Right.
And largely it's just driven off of people's like needs and wants for, things like security and stuff like that. But those will shift because it'll, those base human desires that people have. It's useful for, political narratives.
And there's also like there's two phenomena that we have: an uncertain future and a known past. So our uncertain future always looks very scary. We don't ever know. This could be the Spanish flu, or this could be, a really bad, someplace between Spanish flu and the swine flu, right? It's not gonna be as bad as that. Maybe even not even an order of magnitude as bad as that, but also worse than the swine flu, right? So like, how do you react to neither a crisis nor like something that's a total, dud of an issue? But then we can always look back and say like, well, I knew that, I would be the one who was super calm during the swine flu, and I would be the one who was super woke on the Spanish flu ahead of everybody else. Well, that's an easy thing to assume because we've already been through those things.
Well, in a lot of ways, like that's where principles come in. Because, and I mentioned this on a previous episode, but like if we had this podcast recording, I probably would have been saying a lot of the same stuff, because I was getting very irritated with conservatives and libertarians when they were all ragging on Thomas Massey for his, like, basically what happened was when all the stimulus stuff was coming in and they were just going to have like a what's it called? It's like an anonymous vote. It's not that's not what it's called.
Voice vote.
Yeah, voice vote, right? Yeah. And he was saying no, constituents should actually know where people stand on this thing, and everyone should come in and vote. And he was getting just he was like the enemy of the weak for society. Right?
I think that has less to do with the left-right thing, and that's more of a Beltway versus everybody else thing. Yeah. It's just a violation of the Beltway norms.
Yeah,
right? It's a social club. And if you violate the norms of a social club, there's going to be social consequences. It just so happens that everyone who works at the Hill and is connected to the Washington Post and et cetera, are all part of that club.
Yeah, but then that disseminates down into society, right? But looking back now, Thomas Massey looks pretty good on that.
Yeah.
So, and Thomas Massey just took a principled stand. Like that's so that's in my eyes the pushback on these drastic measures that people take in times of crisis, right? Is principled, like principles.
Well, I mean, and you fall back on your principles. So, like, I think there was a rational explanation of how to approach the COVID crisis right when it hit. That was like, this is the equivalent of a foreign army, right? Government has a role to repel invaders, so therefore we should try to think about this way. Maybe that's the right model to think about it, especially if it's as bad as we thought it was, right? Didn't turn out to be quite as bad as we thought it would be, although it's still serious.
Remember, minimum was 2 million deaths by the end of the year, right?
Right. The Cambridge.
Like if everything was handled properly, it'd be minimum 2 million deaths.
Yeah, because ventilators, we don't have enough ventilators and all these kind of things, which is another issue of scientism, like what we talked about last time.
Exactly.
Which was like a prediction that has a single growth pattern. I'm just going to project that out. But whatever the current growth pattern is, I'm just going to blow that up over 8 months. And said, therefore, I've predicted the future, which isn't how future prediction works, because in society we have much more complex systems.
No. I mean, futurist predictions are just astrology, basically. Like that's all it is.
Right.
Well, I mean, so it's pornography for science. Like
exactly.
that's what it is.
I like that. What I mean is, like, you can describe trends, and we do so in the marketplace all the time. If a constriction of supply happens, what happens to prices?
Yeah, and you can describe trends,
right?
But it's sometimes, especially with something that has so many unknowns as a brand new virus,
or the way the medical industry will adapt to that virus, or the way that the media will adapt, the way the American people will adapt.
Like it's real. Like the idea of you just being able to predict that, like it seems absurd to me. Like how are you even supposed to get those numbers?
The funny thing about that is that it turns out Niall Ferguson, the guy who did the Cambridge study that kind of freaked everybody out and created this whole, like, the start of the panic in at least America and the West. Okay, wait. Let me take a step back. The interesting thing about that story is that for decades, the West has had the same epidemiological plan for how to respond to this situation. And it was something like what Sweden did, which is lock down the people who are a vulnerable risk population. Once you discover who that is, that's almost always going to be the elderly and people with heart conditions and lung conditions and things like that, kind of no matter what the disease is. But you're going to look for those, lock them down, make sure they are protected, and then quickly develop a vaccine and create herd immunity amongst the general public as quickly as possible. Vaccines and having people who aren't at risk being exposed to it are the fastest way to create herd immunities. So that was the plan. And then this guy, Niall Ferguson, comes out, and he had a history, actually, of these predictions, of just disaster predictions. He did the same thing with swine flu, did the same thing with Ebola, he did the same thing with lots of other pandemics, where he just described these giant panics. Well, the difference is that right then, at this time, unlike in those other times, there was a tremendous political incentive. And there was also a very convenient collaboration between major corporations and these people to kind of make this all happen at once, as well as policymakers, to make this a big deal and to make this as big a deal as this. And it's an interesting phenomena to me because of course COVID is a big deal, but the fact that we based it on something that was so systematically and objectively false, and from a guy who had a history of making objectively false predictions. Mm-hmm. And then we said, but we're gonna completely change the plan that the West has designed for pandemic responses based on that guy. And we're gonna adopt China's plan for how to adopt these things, and South Korea's plan, and like the way that those countries in Asia had adapted to these scenarios and how they had done it, even despite the fact that we didn't have any of the required materials. Right? We're not South Korea. We're not Singapore. We didn't have contract tracing up. Mm-hmm. We designed contract tracing 4 or 5 months into this thing. Yeah, and then we were like, well, I guess we'll develop it. So it was an interesting, it was an audible called by nobody, but by everybody, mm-hmm. because some guy freaked everybody out and he had a PhD next to his name, and no one decided to look at his history of predictions and how good he was, or his actual literal credentials. We just looked at
because you blank it out because it follows your current political aims, right?
Also that
and that's the scientism of it, right. And that's kind of because this is a common trend. Like every year there's something. It like in my mind I usually recognize the ones that are happening on the foreign policy level, mm-hmm. Usually of like just straight up false flags and lies to try to pull troops into an area and mm-hmm. stuff like that. And, and then like 3 months later, it's like, oh, no, it's onto a new thing. And then nobody even remembers that thing even remotely happened mm-hmm. because we just all have collective amnesia.
Or the thing that never gets coverage, but it's like a big, big deal.
Yeah, but it's a big, big deal.
Right.
It's just like how many times are we willing to let you get it wrong, mm-hmm. right? Because this just seems to be the standard norm of pushing political propaganda, right?
All right. Well, that's the string to cut. That's at least a string to cut. Yeah. It's like to think about the ways in which the people who exist for you to convince you to consume their content mm-hmm. are there to get you to believe a certain thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we've had to deal with a gas attack in Syria 3 times now, right? and all of them don't seem legit.
Yeah. And definitely didn't turn out the way that we thought they would, mm-hmm. or at least that it was predicted.
Well, and the reporter on the ground just happened to be the granddaughter of Assad's political enemy. like it's kind of there's a lot of strange elements that go into this stuff. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of just international geopolitical disputes that happen in all of these things. Mm-hmm. And some people are probably acting in good faith, but they don't actually understand what is going on, and they're just reporting because reporters mm-hmm. got to get clicks and follow the media industry, and then there's other people that are probably bad faith actors mm-hmm. and know exactly what they're doing, mm-hmm. and it's just like how much are we? And this is one of the things that I'm kind of happy with over the last several years is the veil is kind of being lifted on how we do news and how we do and how we push these different narratives. So yeah, I don't know what the actual answer is to all this, but I'm just kind of happy that people are kind of becoming more skeptical to the mm-hmm. things that they're seeing.
I think part of the prescription is like be skeptical, especially mm-hmm. if something fits your books.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like your guard should be higher whenever it's something that looks good to you. It's often people kind of flip that around. Mm-hmm. They say, "I'm gonna, without question, adopt the ideas of the people who I've already signaled are, agree with me, and I'm going to just on the face of it, just disagree with anyone who disagrees with me in the past." Mm-hmm. And that's like a quick that kind of closeness is a quick way to create the same kind of feedback loops mm-hmm. that create the conditions that we're in now where we can't come to any kind of conclusion about the policy differences, no matter how ineffective mask mandates appear to be. If you look at the data, if you look at the way the ARCs work when they're implemented and how they don't seem to make a difference
at all.
Yeah. In that public,
maybe in small minuscule.
Yeah, and at least in the case outcomes, it doesn't appear to be a thing. So there might be a public dialogue to happen, but we can't seem to ever get to a consensus of that because there's just no conversation happening between the two different groups on that issue.
Well, and I mean, most lockdown culture on whatever side you stand on for masks or, businesses being reopened or whatever, mm-hmm. most of it's just virtue signaling.
A lot of it is. A lot of the activism is.
Yeah,
especially.
Exactly. Like whether or not you do or do not wear a mask, like you're just virtue signaling to your side.
Yeah. What do you mean by virtue signaling?
Trying to get brownie points with a group of people that believe a certain thing, so that you're getting like social credit.
So why do people do that?
Because they want a sense of belonging, right?
Yeah,
onto a team or within a group of people.
Yeah, like when you were in high school and you had a clique, and there were certain things that clique would do to demonstrate its cliqueness, like the place where you had lunch, who you talked to, how you talked. All those things were all ways to demonstrate in-group loyalty.
Slang you use, like all different types.
There's a ton of
crew. There's a ton of different variables that go into it.
Those things continue on past high school. They just change shape, right? You pick a.
They barely even change shape. It's like almost the same still. You see it.
You pick your own. You pick an industry that you got to work for. You're going to pick your the friend group, the hobbies that you pick for, and those are all ways to different signal those things, and that's okay. The question is like, well, one part of getting kind of woke on that issue is to think carefully about human nature itself.
I want to take that word back.
Yeah, right.
I miss that word. I used to use that word all the time.
Exactly. I hate how it's become synonymous with SJW.
Yeah.
That's
a co-opting. Woke was never that. Woke was always red pilling with the Matrix.
Right. Woke was about waking up from being asleep.
Yeah.
And that's like, if you understand what the Federal Reserve is, you're woke. It's not about having the right opinions on social justice, right? In my opinion.
And red pill, blue pill does not mean Republicans, Democrats.
No. Yeah. That was always frustrating to me too. But we're kind of OG millennials like that, I guess. Well, I guess I am.
I'm millennial. I'm just right on the tail end of it.
And I'm right at the beginning.
Yeah.
So what were we talking about?
Sorry, I derailed you.
No, the right way to think about how to behave in that environment. So like if you have to combine that skepticism of especially your own side and like an attachment to principle where you're saying, well, I am actively developing a model for the world and then improving on that model over time as I come across new arguments, new data, and things like that. That means you throw the whole thing out every single time you see something new. It's just that what you're trying to do is you're approaching that with a state of openness, because the state of openness is what allows you to transform to actually react to the reality on the ground rather than to be a religious dogmatic person about a given topic. Virtue signaling is a way that you demonstrate your allegiance to a dogmatic point of view, right? So we've all decided that, I don't know, what's a good consensus opinion that's completely wrong?
Minimum wage, because we always go there.
We've all decided that a higher minimum wage is better for the people at the lower income distribution. And the best way I can demonstrate my in-group loyalty to being sensitive to the plight of the poor is I could talk about how minimum wage is good and how, employers are exploitative or something like that. What that does is it actually keeps you, the minute that you take that on as a virtue signal and not as something to be open about or something to actually engage in the topic about, you've turned it from a public policy discussion into a religious battle.
Yeah.
Which is what
it's a battle. It's a battle of good and evil at that point, because it's like, oh, you hate poor people then, right? You don't want them to get a living wage, and they have their own dogmatic phrasing, like living wage has become a dogmatic phrase that people use. And you'll hear people like, that was never really a phrase, that was just kind of in common parlance, and that became a very common phrase in the last decade, 15 years. And you'll see those types of buzzwords pop up. I usually get so this happens. It doesn't matter who I'm talking with. Liberal, conservative, libertarian, doesn't matter. I always get very skeptical of somebody and the way that they view their own beliefs when there's certain words I'll hear always. And just like, okay, you've probably just kind of latched onto something and you haven't really thought all of this through, or you just kind of are taking this dogmatic approach, especially if you're having like an open dialogue with somebody. Like we all have those dialogues with somebody that will last an hour or two or whatever, and you just kind of see them all of a sudden just fall back into repeating the exact same talking points over and over again, but without any actual like substance behind it. I always become increasingly skeptical of somebody that's like that.
Yeah. Well, it's not that a person's actually a bad actor. It's just they haven't done the requisite work.
Yeah. I'm not saying you're being possessed by certain ideas, right? And that's a Jungian concept.
Yeah, but
Carl Jung, the
also
psychotherapist.
Right. It's also that everyone is possessed by ideas, right? So the question is whether or not you allow yourself to be a puppet of other people's mental models for the world, ways of constructing the world, rather than trying to, not necessarily that you have to make everything whole cloth, but whether you're consciously choosing and picking the things that comport with the world that you want to build or the way you think the world actually is. Great example. Where does material prosperity come from? If you start a dialogue about public policy without answering that question first, without agreeing on the common foundation of where does material prosperity come from, there is not going to be a common foundation you can find, right? There's lots of people who haven't answered that question yet. So you can have educational dialogue, you do all kinds of things. But if you're actually like really getting into it with somebody who disagrees with you, but they think the material prosperity of the world happens on its own or isn't a phenomena that is at all studied or knows anything about that phenomena, and the ridiculous difference in the quality of life that we have now versus the past, you're just not going to get to the same sort of kind of policy conclusions or the same kind of richness and dialogue that you otherwise would. And to challenge somebody else to actually take on those questions if they haven't investigated that, which maybe we could do a whole podcast just about kind of that question and kind of how that's answered by many economists, historians, and philosophers over time. But the common difference is if you have no mental model about how that phenomena happened, that backdrop to almost all human existence in the West right now, and why we're alive as a people or why we have all the things that we do, but you're vociferously convinced that your point of view is the right one and there can be in the other one and any other approach is inherently evil, you're not doing the same thing as me. We're not playing the same game. You're playing a very different game. And so that's kind of where I'm at. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a legitimate dialogue for people who are coming from that left-wing perspective. All right, I think there's lots of things to learn from that. Consolidation of corporate power and how that could potentially harm people. Corporatism as an idea, the way the American foreign policy state works with corporations to benefit corporations and to benefit. Yeah.
Well, in that way, for example, like I'm no Marxist. Like right. I'm a hardcore radical libertarian. I think that there's an interesting point to take a kind of quasi-Marxist analysis of 2020 and how there does seem to have been kind of a corporate takeover that's happened, especially when we're seeing everything that's happened with small businesses.
Yes, look, and we answer this question: what is the Patriot Act of COVID-19? Right? What is It's an interesting one because we had the split Congress. So I think the big thing is the CARES Act, right? Yeah. Printing up that amount of money. We have almost 24% of all dollars in circulation as of now were created this year.
Yeah, it's wild.
So what that does in monetary policy is
at the beginning of the year we were at what, $21 trillion in debt. Now we're at like 26, I think.
So what that does and what the policy consequences of that are going to be enormous. But I have a even more, maybe something that I hope more of, like if you're coming at this from a more of a center left perspective, would appreciate is look at the Great Reset. Shareholder capitalism could be the thing that is the true policy response to COVID-19. Kind of a rebranding of like a large business, corporate, state, technocratic management society, as opposed to what our vision is, which is, well, the government doesn't have any, my vision at least, Marxist, where the government isn't picking winners, isn't managing the economy, where the economy is managed by consumers by allowing them to freely choose based upon an equal playing field. Not a level playing field, but an equal playing field. Where the government doesn't come in and say, this business gets these rules and this business gets different rules. Or you get this tax code because you complied with this thing and this business gets this tax code. Or rather, the government treats businesses the same and is agnostic and exists to protect people's rights. That kind of tension from the corporate vision, which is we're going to have a managed economy where Amazon and Walmart and Apple and all the best companies provide all the services and don't have to suffer competition from the bottom up, because they comport with our vision for what the Great Reset should be or what the future should be. That to me is an incredibly dangerous and terrible idea, right? And that, speaking as someone who's really interested in the kind of the center right economics and center right kind of approach to thinking about how the government should relate to business and ownership.
And the interesting thing about the whole Great Reset thing, and the Great Reset got was trending and then got shoved off the trending page right on Twitter.
The censorship is interesting.
Yeah, and you know, it's the same thing that you saw with like the Hunter Biden story, and which I actually think is quasi linked to the general overall, because it's an interesting thing when you hear kind of like conservative people talking about globalism, and like I think that there's two different dialogues happening on globalism and that are kind of talking past each other, because two different sets of people are talking about completely separate things, and then they're fighting with each other because they don't actually understand what the other one's talking about.
Right.
Because like if you have
using
like
the same word two different ways.
Yeah, because like George Soros wrote a book called Globalism, and I think that's probably the more appropriate term because he's kind of the one that coined it, which is much more this Great Reset model, homogenization of countries, and basically putting in international conglomerates that are controlling things across wide scale regions geographically, you know, Europe, America, and then progressing into the East. But whenever I hear like libertarians talking about globalism, they're just like free trade. And it's like those aren't the same thing. Right. So there's bumping of heads.
To be fair, I think the alt-right decided that globalism was a bad thing because George Soros was for it, and then decided to attack free trade. So libertarians responded.
Well, this happened, but this has been going on long before the alt-right was even a thing in 2015, 2016. Like this was dialogue that was happening during my political awakening when I was in high school. This was dialogue that happened.
Yeah.
So this has been happening for longer than the alt-right.
Well, I mean, what I learned in college was that globalism was the McDonald's going to India and putting the local mom and pop Indian food company out of business, and therefore homogenizing the world into a single. And that was considered a center-left bad thing.
Yeah.
Right. So like the corporate takeover of the third world countries with all of our terrible.
Yeah.
You know, with the.
And McGriddle. Yeah, left wings use that as kind of like a cultural imperialism, and also, but also just like as a foreign anti-war message too. For
it's funny how that actually shook out. Right. It seemed anti-war at the time.
Yeah,
but don't get me wrong. Like I think there are real concerns there, but in you know, it's people's values that shape economic consequences, right? So people's values are I desire cheap food that I like to eat, and I'm not really going to bias myself to the local customer, something like that. So when you have a state of freedom, you're going to have, you know, people choosing both really super niche values, like I'm really into X and that's what I'm going to be into and that's going to be my thing, and I'm in a state of freedom, you're going to have much more abundance to be able to discover other people who are into that thing. And it's also going to allow for the mass society production of generalized things so that everybody has more abundance, period. Right? And that's what we see when it comes to like clothing, t-shirts, foods, you know, lots of things that we've really unleashed the free market and technology, where we have this really increasing abundance where there's lots of access, lots of people getting a hold of it, especially the poorest and least well off. So you got those two forces always pushing each other apart. Now, whenever globalism to me is described as, well, let's allow companies and individuals to as freely move and freely experience the world as possible with as little amount of coercion as possible. And I'm like, I don't know. I guess I'm okay with that. I don't see that.
But I think there's a lot more to it than that. When we're talking about global, international government, government agencies,
right? Where it's a global corporate state, where corporations are given special privileges by governments all over the world to provide resources and stuff like that for people. If it's chosen, right? If the government is deciding out of a cronyist, you know, model to design the world economy, that to me is a problem, right? I'm not on board with the Davos vision of that.
Right.
The trick is like I don't want to mistake the corporations for the governments that are putting them into the role of these managers. Now, don't get me wrong, like some of them might be asking for, I don't know.
Well, these corporate
to me, that's ultimately the ultimate responsibility of the government and of the international institutions that governments created to put those corporations into that role.
Well, and these corporate entities don't care about nationalism or any sense of, like, they don't care about what's actually going on culturally speaking in any of the countries that they're operating in.
Right. Well, I mean,
for the most part.
Yeah, as much as any corporation cares about anything.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
It's not a single entity.
It's purely profit, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what the interesting thing about the shareholder capitalism thing, right? So basically what it says is that there's a greater social responsibility that any corporation has to people. And in a sense that I agree with that. There's a sense in which, I think, corporations and businesses that are connected to a mission do better, right? Not ones that are just connected to profit, but rather to a tangible mission that they feel like is making the world a better place. It makes them last longer, sell better, and do better, right? Profit is a consequence of people's value creation to the customer. And if you center that value creation, not center profit, you do better in the long run. I think Simon Sinek has some awesome work on that. That said, if you lose sight of that and you instead use that justification that corporations need to be value creation centered, not profit centered, or mission centered, not profit centered, and instead you say, well, therefore we're going to use corporations to organize the world in this like giant corporate shibboleth of control and technocracy. I have a problem with that, right? Yeah. So like that would be taken to just like to contrast, you have shareholder capitalism, or stakeholder capitalism, which is the new Davos term of phrase, versus like the old Milton Friedman stakeholder capitalism, which was shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder. Milton Friedman was shareholder, and that was the idea that corporations exist to create profit for their shareholders, period. If they focus on that, they'll do better because profit itself is a socially utilitous thing. It makes the world better. Here's why. If a company is profitable, it means it is effectively deploying resources to consumers in a way that consumers like. It's a way because we can't know before we create a product and sell it to consumers what people are willing to buy. A way to experiment to discover as a larger society how to best take natural resources and pure like raw materials and how to turn them into things that people need. That's what profitability is. Is a measure of that ability to do so efficiently. Unprofitable companies don't do that sufficiently. Therefore, they're not playing the same role. That's why corporations should focus on profit.
Well, and there's also because in an effort to combat globalism, like this international conglomeracy of corporate interests and whatnot, that conservatives have kind of fallen back on a protectionist argument on that. Things like tariffs and it's like, got to make sure it's made in America, and kind of there's division of labor arguments to be had there, but I don't want to go down that right now.
Right.
But there's also, and something I'm also open to as an idea, is I don't know and I don't understand the geopolitical games that are being played between America, China, Russia, and all the major figures, and what all that entails. Because I don't think all of this is just about the economy. Like we're talking about like the largest mafias in the world right now, all competing and vying for resources. And that brings in a whole nother layer of variables and complications that, in a perfect world, I would love for us to all be able to just freely trade, mosey about and all that stuff. But I personally don't understand the geopolitical side of this and how much influence is being had economically, politically, etc., on politicians, corporate bigwigs, and all this stuff between all of these entities at work. And I think most people are being disingenuous and lying if they pretend like they do, whether it be like on a lot of these arguments, right? So yeah, there's a lot of
it's a funny thing
because that comes in with that.
It's clear to me what this should do, and that is the answer to a world dominated by more larger corporations that are controlling and collaborating with these governments to set up favorable regimes of regulation and things like that, and to establish more collaboration for this whole concept of that economics should be used to shape the world, like corporations should be used to determine things. That's the same sort of bad mental model that I would then usually almost always respond to if it was just American domestic politics with, Well, that's the regulator's fault.
Right.
Right. The regulator itself has been put in the charge to make sure that doesn't happen. And regulatory capture is exactly the thing we'd expect to happen when you are in that situation. What we need is a separation between economy and state. What we need is anything peaceful, okay. The problem I have is that people who then say, like, well, I don't know what the influence China has on Walmart, therefore I want to destroy Walmart. It's like, well,
but the
I know you're not saying
the thing is that it also goes deeper. Like, I haven't looked into this right now, but this is a bunch of stuff that's been floating around today and last night. Was Chinese influence on various politicians and like literally buying out politicians like Swalwell, whatever, the guy that farted on TV. He was somebody that was linked to all this stuff.
I don't know the story at all. Apparently,
I must have missed it. Remember the
both the fart story and the buyout story.
Well, he ran for Eric Swalwell, right? He was a primary candidate in the election, congressman out of somewhere. There was a bunch of stuff that just I haven't read into it, so I don't want to get too deep into it. But there's been a bunch of stuff that's been coming out with just China ties with politicians, right? Which is also what the Hunter Biden story was really about. It wasn't about him, doing coke off of a stripper's ass, right?
Right.
It was about China connections and like
China
actual
connections,
money,
Ukraine, Russia,
like bribery and stuff like that, right?
So the idea that there are global elites out running around trying to fix things for their benefit and they don't care about you. I am totally okay with that concept.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so I'm totally okay with skepticism towards global elites who are very wealthy and you want to use that wealth in order to abuse the principles and institutions that I care about, right? Principles and institutions like, the free exchange of goods and ideas and things like that. It's a funny thing because usually what we do is we say you need to have a clear-eyed view and a reality-based view of the world. And then from that, interface with your principles on that world to kind of describe, how to make the world a better place. So to me, a government that is where someone is bought and sold by China, that's a bad thing. That's corruption. We don't like that. It's a bad thing.
But it's also a pretty standard political scandal, right?
But that doesn't suggest that tariffs on China actually made the world a better place.
Yeah. But it's also one of the things, and this is why I kind of have which we mentioned in a previous episode, of there's certain things that I'm kind of willing to, I'm like, okay, like I know what the ought is, or I think I know what the ought should be on certain things like free trade and stuff like that. But the waters are so muddied and there's so much just disinformation, non-information that exists in that current space because of the current where I'm far more interested in what's been going on in the last several years with the discrediting of the deep state academia and the corporate press, because they're the ones that are doing the water muddying, right?
Yeah, so I mean, like, it's funny because like anytime you talk about particulars in trade, it becomes really clear.
Yeah,
it's whenever you're looking at it as like a broad concept.
Yeah, but
same thing with immigration, right? So
because there's more than economics that goes into a lot of stuff, right?
Well, I mean, but economics has a big story to tell.
Geopolitical side of this,
exactly.
Right?
So like anytime you're discussing the details of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and what it actually was or is, it's just that we're not part of it. Really quickly becomes like, wait, what? Like, why are we not in that? Anytime you're discussing, if you discuss it as a low resolution view, I could see how people get there, right? They're skeptical of China, they're skeptical of other countries, they're worried that we're going to take into the cleaners, etc. Those concepts. I get that that's like an intuition that a certain range of people have. But what I'm saying is that but anytime you get into the details, all of a sudden it becomes really clear. Like, should we tariff this thing less? Almost always yes, because it almost always makes the world a better place.
Yeah, because
to not have government taking out and wasting that money.
Yeah, because we had the steel tariffs were pretty damaging, etc.
Exactly.
Like that everything that happened.
There's no doubt. I mean, like, I probably, not always the most popular statement, but there's no doubt that the Trump trade war effort failed. Now, that said, I don't say therefore trade is the most important thing in everyone. It should be everyone's most important political idea, but it is one of the key drivers of how to make the world more equal in the sense of where you can rise at the bottom by creating more abundance. And the same thing with immigration. It's one of those things that it's a kind of a sleeper issue unless you're actually directly connected to it, but it is one of the things that drive American and global prosperity probably more than anything else, because just being able to realign supply and demand with labor improves everyone's life.
No, it's how you fix the poverty problem in Africa, and that's currently happening as more and more people every year are being lifted out of poverty, and it's simply just because of trade and innovation.
Right.
Like those are the two driving factors.
And if you don't believe that, the old statistic, this statistic, it's been said quite a bit now, but more people have left poverty in the last 10 years than the last 100 years combined.
Yeah.
And in the last 20 years, in the entire history of the globe, that's how many people we're talking about. So when you look at that and you look at the environmental effects of those people leaving poverty, the poorest people in the world are the people who pollute the most, who are the most damaging to the environment. The wealthier are the less damaging to the environment. Some exceptions apply, like how much are you concerned about carbon? But even then, you have significant problems with even carbon emissions amongst the very poorest, and a reduction in carbon emissions without a reduction in quality of life for the most wealthy. So when you look at all those measures and you notice that increasing abundance amongst the global poor is one of the best things you can do. One of the fastest things you can say is, well, that means we should have as low trade barriers as possible and low as immigration barriers as possible. That said, that doesn't mean that there are certain bad actors to be aware of.
Yeah.
Right. So if China buys up all of your infrastructure and now owns your country, that could be a bad thing, given that they're an autocratic
pretty much
dictatorship.
what's happening.
Well, it's an interesting thing, right? So if you buy municipal bonds in Greece, it's not the same thing as actually buying Greece.
Yeah,
it means you own a bad investment in Greece, right? So if you buy municipal bonds in Calgary, you don't own Canada. That's not how it works. That's what a municipal bond is. So like people kind of take these things and they look for a global bad guy, and then they just kind of stick with the narrative that everything they do is actually devious. But dude, I remember in 2008 talking to people like, man, it's a real problem that the Chinese government owns an enormous amount of our debt. It is a problem. Why? Because how do you service debt? Sovereign debt. It's a. Do we just say no? I'm not going to pay if interest rates climb too much, we can't afford it?
Like, is that the answer? Because
how do you default?
Soon we're getting very close to the point of just interest on the debt being higher than anything that we're currently putting in. Right?
I think it was like $400 billion.
Yeah,
something like that.
Which I only imagine after this year that's skyrocketing.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Right? I don't even know. I mean, the interest rates are still relatively low, but those interest rates are set by the Federal Reserve. So
exactly.
like eventually there's going to be some kind of inflationary pressure where they have to raise interest rates. I would guess. Yeah. I mean, like, I don't know. It's an interesting thing because
do we just start seeing a mass exodus to crypto and stuff like that? Right?
Probably not. Well, it needs to have utility. This is the problem. Like, and that's my beef. I'm not a financial advisor, and I'm like barely a qualified economist of any sort. I'm not even qualified, so don't take any investment advice.
You're just more well studied than the average person.
Yeah, barely. But to me, I just don't see. There has to be an end to the financial games, right? There has to be. You cannot print this kind of money. You cannot go in this kind of debt. You cannot do these things that the government is doing and the Federal Reserve is enabling.
Well, it took like
without some kind of consequence.
Because Rome went through the same type of stuff. They didn't have the technology to go through what we did, but they did large inflation and welfare projects and stuff like that. Yeah. And it took 400 years for it to catch up to them.
Yeah.
Like this game could probably go on much longer.
Yeah.
A lot of it just kind of depends on people's buy-in to the system.
I do think it's interesting when people like Camille Paglia and people like that talk about an empire in decline as like the defining way to think about and appropriately contextualize American culture. I often put it in my mind as a time horizon of like my lifetime. Right? I think of it like in the next 30 years.
Yeah.
But what she means is we're in a 200-year or 400-year period, we're maybe at year 120,
right? Yeah,
or something like that.
Yeah, well, because
interesting
because like I'm not going to explain who these people are, but like the Dionysian reforms in Rome would be like the equivalent of the Progressive era or like Woodrow Wilson, but like Rome still had another 400 years after that. So and then there was just kind of like, different leaders that were doing all these different shenanigans over the course of 400 years that eventually all led to this point that they went where they collapsed. And then there's also like overexpansion of military and like all these different, cultural degradation, all those things go
lost a republic, turned into an empire, all that kind of stuff.
All of that stuff kind of comes into place there. So it's like, where are we in that cycle? Because no doubt in my mind, I think it's almost proper to classify America as an empire. Like It's just what we are, right?
It really hurts feelings.
It really does hurt feelings.
Yeah, it's like the nicest empire ever. It's like we're an empire and we're gonna give you lots of stuff. Hey, you want some porn?
But so
welcome
did,
to America.
But so did Rome, right?
Right.
Like Rome was giving out free wheat, like tons and tons of free wheat.
Yeah,
right?
but we sell culture.
Yeah,
right, which is interesting.
So did Rome.
Airplanes. Well, I know.
Right?
Like, they were like,
it's just different technology.
Hey, want some plays?
Right?
And we're like, hey, want Avengers?
Yeah.
Like it's. I get it. I'm not saying your analogy's bad. I just don't know much about the Roman thing. I've heard those analogies a lot over my time.
Rome had gladiators and public bathhouses, right? Like that was.
So, and we have football and
like football is our gladiatorial sport,
right. I like to think MMA, but
MMA is another one. Like it's just sports ball in general, right? Just like they saw a man get eaten by a tiger, and we're just like, man, he crossed that line.
Right.
With a ball in his hand. Right.
So I guess to me, you're right. The appropriate way to think about it when it comes to both like military deployments overseas, we have. Oh man, I'm probably gonna mess up the statistic because I can't recall it right now, but 5,000 bases in 168 countries or something like that. I think that's with forward operating bases. I think it's actually like 300 permanent bases in 160 countries.
I think it's more like 500 permanent bases. I think is what it is. Yeah.
So no, there's like 190 something, 200 countries in the world, and we have bases in almost all of them. Right.
Yep.
We say the sun never set on the British Empire.
Mm-hmm.
They ain't got nothing on us when it comes to literal
bases
that we pay for overseas, right? So we have this massive buildup in response to the Cold War, and now we're kind of left with this whole apparatus we built in order to defeat the Soviets, and now we're just kind of like, well,
might as well use it. We gotta continue the Woodrow Wilson of making the world safe for democracy, right?
Right. That whole mission. It's an interesting problem, right? Because there is a new book being put out by Cato right now, specifically about that pivot, that change, that place where apparently this is a great story from one of the interviews on the book. Woodrow Wilson was debating before we ever got involved in World War II what the post-World War II world would look like.
Yeah, he was.
What they're going to replace the League of Nations with, all that kind of stuff.
I've read his speeches on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because like. It's definitely it's definitely one of those Davos situations. Never let a good crisis go to waste.
It was a very ongoing and heated dialogue between him and Teddy Roosevelt on that too.
Right.
Like they both basically wanted the same thing. They just had slightly different avenues, and it was like a division within the progressives between Teddy and Woodrow on that.
But I would say like it wasn't ever planned to be this kind of giant corporate conglomerate state, right? It's more like they wanted a certain amount of institutions, and these other institutions kind of arose spontaneously out of that. Like, for example, I would be the first one to say the post-World War II conclusion that free trade is better than protectionism really made the world much more better off, raised a lot of people out of poverty, etc. Kind of made that case. But that doesn't justify, like special deals for Chiquita Banana because they had the right people at the World Health Organization to to make the pathways smooth so that small regional banana producers can't compete with Chiquita. That's not like that. That to me is a bad thing, right, in the world. So it's the interesting thing about these institutions is that they both are this driver of good progress, but they were designed in an era to combat the Cold War, not in an era to not with a clear principled, perspective that we could now bring to it, because we now can see a lot of the actual consequences of the way that these things were structured that kind of tended to bias towards the largest regional producers and then rewarded those larger mass producers to make them even larger. So and that's a broad criticism. I wouldn't suggest that therefore that all of these institutions are bad. It's just that they have both good and bad in them. And so what we got to do is we have to transform those institutions through like careful articulation of how they should be into something new, something that's going to encourage the most amount of mutual benefit and most amount of abundance for the average person, rather than rewarding the people with the best lobbyists and the best institutional
but also the muddying of these waters has always been a thing too.
Right.
Like the censorship and absolute slander of people that go against the zeitgeist has always been a thing. I'm spacing on his name. He was during the progressive era. He's the one that wrote the essay "War is the Health of a State." But he was a progressive, and it was kind of
Albert J. Nock.
No. He was a progressive. He was a journalist that worked for the Atlantic. Randolph Bourne is what his name was.
Oh.
And
I was way off.
Yeah.
My bad.
And he was in that club of like John Dewey, Woodrow Wilson, him, and all this stuff. And when Woodrow Wilson was really pushing the war drums and making the world safe for democracy, he kind of had his red pill moment on the movement that he was now a part of, because he was a liberal. But it's when that liberal progressive blending of language was starting to happen, and he wrote that this was all a bad idea, the entrance of World War I, and just like, what are we doing going in over and trying to like flip these monarchs? Like, what does a farmer in Iowa have anything to do with these monarchs in Germany, right? And he wrote that, and all of his progressive buddies just turned on him. He was a cripple, and they just started saying weak of body, weak of mind. And they just completely slandered him, and he was completely pushed out of polite society because of him going against the zeitgeist. And so like this type of stuff that we're seeing with like Twitter censorship and like what's allowable opinion and just the muddying of waters and pure propaganda, like it's always been a thing. It's always been a thing.
That's why it's always required courage. It's always required someone to stand up and articulate what they think is true about the world, and damn the consequences. And that attitude, you know, it's important to do that with integrity. It's important, like the reason why shareholder versus stakeholder capitalism both fail is because it's required of people to embrace their virtue and to actually like articulate and embody in the world the things that they want to see. And that's going to be done imperfectly. And it's going to be done with people trying to articulate right and sometimes falling short, like I'm sure I do all the time, or we do all the time.
Everyone does.
Right. But to have the bravery to go out and do that thing, that is the thing that makes the world a better place.